Welcome back to We Heart Therapy. You're watching your guide to therapy and coaching. I'm your host, Anabelle Bugatti. With me today, I have special guest Sam Tielemans. He's a therapist here in Las Vegas, Nevada, and he specializes in sex addiction, which is our hot topic for today. Thank you so much for being with us, Sam.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about sex addiction. I know that when people say the word sex addiction, a lot of people have all these ideas or misconceptions about what sex addiction really is. So can you talk to our viewers a little bit about what some of the myths or misconceptions might be?
Sure. Yeah, I agree. I think lots of people have what sex addiction is in their head, and I think it's distorted based on media, based on perception. I think one of the most common misconceptions is that sex addiction is about sex. Sex addiction is basically, it's a symptom. Underneath the acting out behaviors, people struggle with emotional issues such as trauma or shame or these faulty core beliefs. And the way that they cope with it is through sex. So sex, yes, in and of itself is an issue when it's used compulsively and destructively, but at the core, it's not about sex at all. It's just the way through which they try to cope with their pain.
Right. So sometimes when people hear the word sex addiction, they might think, oh, if my partner's a sex addict, oh, he just wants sex all the time, and that's
Right.
what that means. But underneath it all, sex isn't actually, it's more the symptom, the way that people act out through sexual behavior. But deep down, it's not even really about sex.
That's right, because it doesn't matter how much sex somebody gets or how much pornography somebody watches or how many strip clubs they visit. It's a faulty way to fill a bucket that they're trying to get filled, which is They want to connect, they want to feel accepted, they want to feel loved.
Right.
Sex doesn't offer that. Sex is a way for people to express love, a way to feel love, feel close to your partner, but the act in and of itself doesn't translate to feeling accepted.
Right.
So they chase this endlessly. If I just have sex in this position, or if she would say yes to sex 3 times a day, then that would mean I'm worthy, I'm acceptable, she loves me.
Right.
So that's just a distorted message that people often get.
Right. So what does sex addiction look like exactly, and how might it look different for men versus women?
So that's a kind of a tricky question because it's not based on frequency. A part of what people we use to diagnose sex addiction is are they using that as a way to cope? If that doesn't happen, what happens? Is there agitation? Is there anger? Are they constantly preoccupied with it? Do they use sex as a way to, like at the cost of their job? Sometimes people will act out watching pornography on the computer at work when it's not allowed, but because they're driven so much to do so, at the cost of family, friendships, finances, like all of these things, they'll still pursue that avenue in a destructive way.
Right. So I think one of the biggest pieces of information that you just said there is that it's not necessarily based on frequency. So again, comes back to that misconception that somebody who's a sex addict just wants sex all the time. And they may not have sex very often, but it sounds like there's a cycle of addiction, just as there might be with other types of addiction that's involved in this sexual acting out. And it sounds like for folks who are suffering from addiction, for sex addiction, that they may engage in the behavior even despite the risks or the perceived consequences to maybe their job or their family, their personal life, those types of things.
That's right.
And so what does sex addiction look? I know it's a lot harder to find in women than for men, but it does exist. So can you talk a little bit more about how sex addiction might show up for women versus men?
I think for women, many times it does show up in a similar way where they do engage in sex, but it's kind of for this hopes of feeling loved and accepted and validated by the other person. Other times people, it kind of shows up as like a love addiction where they seek that closeness from the other person and they use sex to be able to get, or what they in their mind say is like keep the other person with them. And so again, I think it all comes back to these same core needs that we all have, which is acceptance and love and belonging. And when the wires get crossed and they seek for those needs to be met through sex, it just becomes a compulsive way to seek to get those needs met.
Right, and most of the time we're talking about in relationships, the partner or the spouse who is sex addicted is not turning in towards their spouse, or whatever reason they might have tried to turn to their spouse to have those sex needs met, but their spouse has not been open to that, or maybe there's been discrepancies there for whatever reason, they're not able to get that need met within their relationship. So they start turning outside of the relationship for sex needs.
That's right. And I think a part of that is sometimes in the beginning stages of recovery, they won't be able to identify the reason why they turn out. It's because they're not connecting with their spouse in many cases. They don't know how to turn to them in a way that brings their spouse closer, that they can connect on an emotional level.
Right.
They just point to, well, we're not having sex, so I'm going to go out here. Because, you know, men need sex. We have to, the women needs to support us in this way. Many times people believe that. And it can get them in trouble because, again, sex is just the avenue through which they think connection comes.
Right.
When in reality, they're seeking that emotional closeness.
Right.
But it comes out in that way.
And I find with a lot of clients too, they sort of mistake sex for intimacy. And they don't really understand, you know, they might actually be seeking intimacy, you know, women and men alike, and they are using sex as a replacement for that intimacy, and they can't seem to get that intimacy. They don't feel close in their connection. So let's try to get more and more sex because that's the way I find intimacy.
Right. And what another part of this is that I think another misconception is sex addiction doesn't exist. It's not real. Because I think there's two different camps in this field where some people say, yes, it does exist. We're getting new brain scans and research that does support that the brain does change neurologically because of the neuroplasticity of the brain, to where the cues of certain triggers get wired in, and sex is the craving and the reward that they seek based on certain cues.
Right.
And so it does rewire the brain in a way that you crave sex or whatever act it is. It can be food, it can be alcohol, it can be gambling, the substance or behavior. Your brain craves that in the same way it would something healthy. But I think the addiction, as it becomes further and further used compulsively, it sharpens and strengthens those neural pathways to where that becomes the way that they try to get most of their needs met.
Just like with other addictions, it sounds like for sex addiction, it actually sort of rewires the brain neurologically, and some of the research indicates that it actually shrinks the brain. But an important factor, I think, is that the reward center is stimulated during this hunt for sexual activity, and it's stimulated the same way as somebody who's taking cocaine would get stimulated. Wow, that's pretty interesting. So, you know, for people who might be sitting here struggling, wondering if their behavior meets sex addiction, I mean, what does it look like, the acting out behavior? Like, you know, I think for women you see, you know, maybe frequent affairs, stepping out of the relationship chronically, even though they feel that they aren't getting intimacy needs met by these affair partners. But for men, what might the acting out behavior look like?
Some of the more common behaviors is pornography. And a part of why that's the case is because it's so accessible. And you can go online and it's free, and you can find it anywhere at any time, and you can be anonymous. So many people delve into pornography, and for some people it progresses to other things like strip clubs or chat rooms or prostitutes. For some people it just stays with pornography. For other people, they don't delve into pornography, but they do find themselves in relationships where they can't be faithful. And they step out of the relationship, similar to how you mentioned with some women that they do the same. And so I think it does show up in whether it is by themselves through pornography and masturbation or with other people.
And what's the earliest, or what does research say is the earliest exposure to pornography?
So research says that it's between ages 9 and 11 that people are exposed to pornography. And especially nowadays, pornography is very different now than it used to be in 20, 30 years ago when it was just a page. You know, you have a centerfold of a magazine. But now it's graphic and it's hardcore. And if you're 9 or 10 years old, we don't have the ability to process what we see, and so it freezes the body. There's this shock value, this shock factor. There's this curiosity. There's the body responds as it should. It gets aroused, but if they've gotten messages, especially at home, that pornography is bad and we shouldn't be doing this, it can be confusing for kids. And so sometimes they don't know what to do, so they keep it to themselves. And again, that curiosity brings them back, and so they start to look at pornography again. And thinking about it in the bigger context, if they're living in a home where there isn't secure attachment, there isn't that closeness, there is fighting and if their parents are divorced, or even if they're together, but it's not a relationship that provides safety, they start to learn that if I turn to pornography, I don't feel so stressed, I don't feel so lonely, I don't feel so bad, because over here, neurochemically, I get a release. Of course, they're not thinking all of this, but their body responds in that way.
Right.
And that's a part of what wires the brain in that way, is that when I'm stressed, or when I'm traumatized or abused or neglected, the pornography fills the void in the moment because of that release. And so the brain starts to train itself to reach to that instead of somebody else.
Right. And even in the context of committed relationships, it sounds like it works very similarly if they don't have that secure attachment with their spouse or partner to turn to.
That's exactly right. And that's a part of what I think we talk a lot about in this field, the idea of sobriety versus recovery. And many people do achieve sobriety, and they can hold on to that for a certain period of time, but many times it's the addiction or the acting out behavior is replaced with something else, like food, or video games, or the internet, or alcohol. They find another way to cope with the emotional trauma and pain that they have, because they're just white knuckling through sexual sobriety. They're saying, I'm not going to look at pornography. I said I wouldn't. My marriage is going to dissolve if I keep looking at it, so I just won't. But then the symptom shows up in another way, because they haven't learned how to connect.
Right. So what I hear you saying that's super important is that there's a difference between sobriety and recovery. And sobriety looks more like maybe abstinence from the sexual acting out behavior, such as pornography use. But they tend to, when you're in recovery, you learn to connect, and you don't replace that acting out behavior with something else, like food addiction or something else. But if you stay only in recovery, and you don't work on the relationships and the underlying emotional issues, you're likely to just replace the sex addiction, the sexual acting out behavior, with some other way of acting out and replacing that connection need.
That's exactly right. And what we'll often tell people is that sobriety is just a fraction of what is important in this journey. Yes, it is important. We don't want to minimize that. But if it's only sobriety that you have, the addiction is just, one step away, or a different kind of an addiction is just one step away, because you haven't learned. Another part of what we'll tell people is sobriety isn't the cure for addiction, it's connection. And so the more connected we are with people that we trust and feel safe with, and we can get our emotional needs met, the need to act out becomes less and less intense, because what they're trying to cope with is not being able to connect in the first place.
Right.
And so once there's that bond, there's that closeness, then again, the acting out isn't as intense.
That's so important. So it sounds like just achieving recovery is more temporary change. Just achieving sobriety is more temporary change, whereas achieving full recovery is more permanent change.
That's right. It's more of a lifestyle change.
Yeah. So what does recovery look like for somebody going through sex addiction? Is it possible to recover from this, and what does treatment look like?
Yeah. So I think it's important to know that sometimes, I think one of the old ways of thinking about it is once an addict, always an addict. And I think that minimizes the brain and the person's ability to heal. And so I think it's encouraging to know that if you were an addict, you can find healing, you can achieve recovery and sobriety and live a different lifestyle to where you're not, one step away from acting out all the time and having to white knuckle. And so a part of what this recovery process looks like is, number one, getting a plan of action in place. Yes, we need to figure out how to get sobriety, plugging up the holes. So for example, if you know that you're always acting out on your smartphone at work, then that might mean getting a phone that doesn't have access to the internet. Or just finding ways to prevent yourself from acting out. And so getting something in place is an important piece. Excuse me. I think another part of this is getting a support network, because recovery is not achievable on our own. And so finding groups, finding sponsors, people that you can trust to open up with, getting a network of support in place is important.
And what type of support groups are there available? So
there's lots of support groups here in town. Some of them here at ADO, we run support groups for men and women separately. I know that SA Lifeline has men's and women's groups as well.
And they're national.
And those are national, so you can find those anywhere. So basically in most places where you are, there's either physical groups that you can show up to, or there's groups online as well.
And then there's another program, Lifestyle
Recovery. There's Lifestyle as well here in town, so there's a few different options. And
are they national as well?
They do have national, nationally in terms of offices, there are maybe 20 headquarters or 20 locations throughout the valley. Or, excuse me, not throughout the valley, throughout the nation. So depending on the city, Lifestar might be available in your city as well.
So it sounds like part of the process of recovery and getting treatment is to put some boundaries in place to help, you not sort of reoffend, I guess, or fall off the wagon. Getting a good recovery or support group, having like a sponsor, getting into a group treatment program through the various ones that we mentioned, and probably seeing a good therapist, right?
Seeing a good therapist who can guide you in the last part of these. I think there's 4 steps. We can break it down easily too. So achieving sobriety, getting a network of support. Thirdly, rebuilding self-esteem, challenging old core beliefs, old values, old ways of seeing ourselves in a flawed way, because many people who struggle with addiction think of themselves as unworthy or unlovable. And so challenging that and building self-worth. And the fourth piece, which is what many people miss actually, is healing the trauma. Because if we've experienced trauma when we were younger, whether it's abuse or neglect or rejection or abandonment, and if those wounds aren't healed, that person's going to be susceptible to wanting to cope in an unhealthy way if their need isn't getting met through the healthy way of connection. So finding a therapist who's trained to work with trauma and addiction can help people gain full recovery.
Yeah, that's so important to make sure that you heal the underlying trauma and emotional problems that started this whole thing in the first place.
Yeah.
Now, so here in Las Vegas, you work here at Addo Recovery. This is a brand new center that was built for Las Vegas residents specializing in recovery from sexual addiction, correct?
That's right.
Awesome. So they have a site, addorecovery.com?
AddoRecovery.com. There is lots of resources. There's another partner program that Addo connects with. It's called Bloom for Women, and that has lots of videos. It has training programs. It has a whole network for women who struggle with, because a part of, I think, which is important, is the spouses or partners of people who struggle with addictions. Their self-esteem is impacted. Their world is shattered when they find out that their husband or partner has been viewing images of other women, or sleeping with other women, or chatting or texting. Just the betrayal that they experience. There is a whole network of people who offer support for them as well. So it's both for the men and the women.
So in addition to the sex-addicted person seeking recovery and treatment, it's important for the spouse or the partner of the person who is a sex addict to also receive treatment to help them recover from the betrayal that's occurred, and hopefully eventually rebuild the relationship pieces.
Yeah, that's right.
So addorecovery.com. Sam Tielemans, you have a website, samtielemansmft.com.
That's right.
So if you're interested in working with Sam, you can find him here at Addo Recovery or on his own website, samtielemansmft.com. We thank you so much for joining us today on this special topic, recovering from sex addiction. Thank you again for joining us at We Heart Therapy, and as always, more episodes are on the way.